talk about budget cuts and funding cuts all you want, but if you look at the facts, and the facts is despite the vicissitudes of funding and things, the organizations and the community-based organizations, primarily settlement houses, have been relied on as government, in effect, has said we do not want to run these services anymore directly, but we believe that one should contract them out, and we want you, nonprofit community agencies, to sort of be the engine of service delivery. So you can talk about cuts all you want, and we should talk about it, because I'm not saying it's not serious, but the agencies have grown tremendously over the years, and really are, you know, significant players in neighborhoods around delivering programs for kids, for seniors, for those who are homeless, providing housing, an array of services. So if I look at Goddard, for example, and I guess I had the advantage of, you know, of having been involved not only from the grassroots and from the agent, but having seen the development and the growth of all of our services. And those, at least in our case, and I think it's true, I think it says something about us as an organization, that the development of programs and services in the neighborhood always grew out of a need that was seen in that neighborhood and community. So, in the mid-1970s, Goddard gets a grant to work with kids on the streets. It's called a delinquency prevention program in those days now, you know, sort of old language. But because there were kids on 87th Street, 93rd Street, 95th Street, right in that neighborhood, who were hanging out and getting into trouble. It wasn't as if we were transporting kids in there. So
they still up and now they go to Trinity.
You know, in the late 70s and early 80s, you began to see numbers of people who were literally living out in the streets because the housing stock was changing and the psychiatric hospitals were downsizing, and there were no community mental health programs at that time. So if you'd walk along Broadway, or you went to Central Park, you went to Riverside Park, you'd literally see people sleeping there. So our notion was, gee, there are people in our neighborhood. We're not going to open up an office and say, come indoors. We began to reach out and actually go with workers and staff to where people are to try to get them off the street. And what started as an outreach program eventually involved, because once you reach out to people, then you say, where are they going to stay, where are they going to be? And not to go into the whole homeless issue or the supportive housing issue, we began to develop permanent programs and permanent housing. And what we began to do is to take over some old buildings that were being sold at that time, and most of these were SROs, and converting them into permanent housing. So our housing programs began to develop. Another area of sort of growth is that we recognize the need for young people to what happens after they graduate high school and where do they go. And we started a program called Options, which is a college access program. So if I look at our growth and development, and I think it's really, really key to think about it, that it really sort of grew out of the needs that were presented and placed in that neighborhood and community. So let me tell you a couple of things that I see as challenges, and then I'll stop and we'll and people have heard me say this before. Getting to the government funding and things. One of the real challenges that I believe we face around government funding is that I feel that this administration, and I'm talking about the city administration, and the emphasis and the push towards the regionalization of programs and services. And there are examples around senior case management and senior centers and home delivered meals and homeless services, really is moving away from neighborhoods, where the organizations that are primarily really neighborhood-based, multi-service-based, are being forced to, because of city government, take on much larger areas, and in fact, require greater infrastructure and to be a little more, if I may, more corporate. There is this notion of, you know, we want to take a service area and have a single point of accountability. So, you know, Goddard Riverside through St. Matthews, they used to run a home delivered meals program, now has to subcontract with another agency and provide meals for a much larger region. And I think you see it in areas of early childhood. You see it in homeless services, in case management, and also in senior services. So I think this is a real thing we need to fight, because I think what we're beginning to do is move away from some of our roots, which is really that we're in communities and neighborhoods and multi-service. I also think, and this is what Nancy hinted at, that you know, we have to sort of take charge and control, I think, of the conversation. You know, the language that we now use has changed tremendously. So you go, and all the funders, they're talking about return on investment, talk about outcome, data-driven, business models. Those kinds of language and approach has sort of replaced the language of social reform, of social and economic justice, of the rights that we believe that everybody has to decent housing, to adequate income, and to food. And I'm afraid that we as a group and an agency, as a universe, don't talk about issues about how we're gonna end poverty. That agencies have become really more, and settlement houses too, become more of sort of a menu of services rather than an ideal of how we sort of move towards the kind of society that we want to be. If you look at what Hull House did in that area of Chicago, they took volunteers, and there was actually this incredible map, and they mapped out every block. And the block, of course, it was about immigration, so they had different colors on each block, and there were Italians and Germans and Polish, and 10 different ethnic groups. And then they had another map that talked about the income levels of everybody who was on that block, from the prostitutes on the streets and from who were in the brothels to people who are. So they were really doing the social research way back then. And that's how they sort of developed their programs and the services and what they believe. So I think what we need to do to make a change is go back to our roots and organize. And I'm going to give you 3 examples and go back to organize those people who are most affected by the potential cuts in services. And I mean whether you're closing senior centers, whether parents are going to lose daycare, or whether young people are going to lose their summer jobs, that if you go back to our original roots and work with those constituents and those people, then that's the most effective way that we're going to bring change. So I'll give you 3 examples in a little way that I think we did it at Goddard. So one example is I gave you this article around home delivered meals, where the city sort of changed its whole policies, and we discovered that in changing the way it delivered meals, about 250 people were cut off from meals that were on these meals. And we went out and we found what happened to those people and created a program. So we used the experience of those we served to inform us in how we wanted to go forward. Another example is, if you were at Goddard Riverside last week or a couple of weeks ago, our dining room had over 300 people at a meeting around rent regulations, about extending rent stabilization and rent regulation, because people are really, really worried about deregulation and what the state legislature is going to do around changing the rent laws and about losing their housing. There are over 300 people there. And the legislators were there, and there's a big meeting, there's a lot of discussion. They said, gee, if they're going to put a cap on property taxes, they should extend rent regulations so people won't lose their homes. Third example, and I'll stop. If you've been reading on the west side where the city has been planning to take over a single-room occupancy building on 94th Street, it's an old issue. Nancy and I feel like we're going back 30 years ago. And put 200 homeless people and open up a shelter on 94th West End. Our SRO law project, which has been working to protect tenants' rights for a number of years, represents there are about 10 or 12 people who are still there and who are trying to get bought out by the landlord. Although the city says until the building is empty, we won't use it. So our organizer, I watched our organizer at a meeting just the other day, and about 10 of the 12 existing tenants she's been organizing, and they're holding out because they want to keep their homes. So we're not, I understand the government and I understand all the business models and what we have to do to run these agencies, but my feeling is where we go is we go back to our roots and go back to some of those original reformers, and we continue to organize. And I do believe, despite taking government money, despite the, despite the business stuff, and despite all the stuff we have to deal with, that that's still possible. Thank you.